Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Guillermo, for the introduction. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be speaking here at this colloquium. As Guillermo said, I'm going to be speaking about the human sense of self, particularly what certain neuropsychological conditions have to tell us about the role of the body in creating our sense of self, in making us who we are. Over the last couple of days, interacting with many people at IBM and also hearing the talks today, I was beginning to ask myself, so what does this have to do with cognitive computing? And in some sense, we're talking about using cognitive computing to augment our own experience of being alive. And in some sense, if we don't, if we're unable to answer the question, who am I, with a certain amount of clarity, it would be very difficult to design cognitive systems that are able to interface with us with any kind of efficacy. So the more and the better we can answer the question, who am I, the better we'll be able to design the systems that all of you are talking about. So when we say the human sense of self, I think we all have an intuitive understanding of what that means. It's there when we wake up, it disappears when we go to sleep, and perhaps to reappear in our dreams. It's also this sense of being a body. All of us right now, hopefully, are feeling embodied, that we're all feeling that we occupy a certain volume of space that is taken up by this body, that we own this body. I mean, these seem to be very trivial things to be saying, but in terms of neuroscience, trying to explain how these things come about is not trivial. So the idea of having a sense of ownership, that this is my body. We also have a sense of perspective on the world. We look out at the world from behind our eyes. We have this sense that what we perceive is private to us, that we all have a subjective experience of what's going on. And then there's also this sense of existing over time, across time. So if you were to think back to your earliest memories, or if you imagine a future self, a few years hence, there's this sense that it's the same person that was there when you were 4 years old or 10 years hence. So all of these things and a few things more go into creating our sense of self. So, and when we put it like that, you might wonder, what is really the mystery? So that's what it is, and let's get on with it. And I just wanted to read you a quote from philosopher Thomas Nagel, which kind of puts it way more poetically than I would be able to. It seems outlandish that the centerless universe, in all its spatio-temporal immensity, should have produced me of all people. There was no such thing as me for ages, but with the formation of a particular physical organism at a particular place and time, suddenly there is me for as long as the organism survives. How can the existence of one member of one species have this remarkable consequence? And that is the essential mystery, or question. Some may not think of it as a mystery. And when you're confronted with something like the self, it's inevitable that there are going to be debates about the nature of the self. For instance, there are debates about whether there is a self or not. Can the self exist independently of all else? So philosophers call this problem, they ask the question, does the self have an independent ontological reality? What that means is, we know that the material world can be decomposed, or we can explain the material world as being constituted of fundamental particles of nature, electrons, quarks, gluons, and so on. Can the self eventually be described as being constituted of these material constituents, or does the self have an independent reality, independent of the material world? These are the sort of questions that have been asked over and over again by philosophers, by neuroscientists, by theologians. And of course, you would have heard over and over again, especially over the last few decades, that the self is an illusion. Well, if it's an illusion, then whose illusion is it? So these are the kinds of questions that keep popping up when you ponder the nature of the self. And one of the things to try and get at when you're trying to see what these debates are about is to actually understand what aspects of the self philosophers and neuroscientists are actually thinking about when they're trying to explain the nature of the self. And basically, it comes down to trying to understand two kinds of unities that we experience. One is something called synchronic unity, which is right now, all of you are experiencing this just as you're sitting in your chairs, which is you're hearing me speak, you're watching the screen and the stage, you're also you're feeling the sensation of your body on the seats. All of these perceptions are being experienced as being experienced by the same entity, the same person. It's not as if someone is seeing the stage and someone else is hearing the sound. Your experience of all these perceptions is that there is a unity to them. They're all being experienced by the same entity. Again, it seems trivial to talk about, but neuroscientifically, philosophically, these are important questions. How does this unity come about? The other thing is diachronic unity. I just mentioned that we have this ability to go back in time. We can imagine ourselves when we were 4 years old, or you can imagine your future self 10 years hence. And some perceptions arise in you as you imagine or remember things about your own self. Now, again, there is a certain kind of unity to those perceptions. They seem to be happening to the same entity, to the same person. I specifically use the term entity, not person, sometimes because we're unclear what that thing is underneath it all, right? So, in some sense, these two unities, the synchronic unity and diachronic unity, are the things that we need to explain neuroscientifically, and that can tell us how the brain constructs, how the brain and body together construct the sense of self. It's very hard to introspect and figure out what might be happening because there is this unity. So one approach in trying to understand what might be happening here is to actually take a look at certain neuropsychological conditions that disturb our sense of self, that sort of create cracks in the way we feel about ourselves. And that's what I did over the last 4 or 5 years, trying to understand how neuropsychological conditions change our sense of self, and can we, by looking at how each condition changes the self, can we understand something about how the brain puts it together in the first place. And when I say brain, it will become clear that I always mean brain and body together. It's not just the brain sitting there doing something. The body is very much involved, and in some sense that is the topic of today, just to emphasize the role of the body. These were the conditions I looked at. We won't have time to go into all of them, but I'll pick some to give you a sense for how these conditions can illuminate the nature of the self. So Alzheimer's disease, unfortunately, a lot of us will be familiar with this because we would know friends or family members who are suffering. There are some conditions here that are probably not known to some of you. Body integrity identity disorder. This is a condition in which people feel like some part of their body is not theirs. Schizophrenia, depersonalization disorder. Autism, again, is increasingly visible now, more and more. Autoscopic phenomena, these are phenomena that include out-of-body experiences. Ecstatic epilepsy, which is a particular form of epilepsy. And Cotard syndrome, which is a very, very rare but very intriguing condition in which people claim that they don't exist, that they're already dead. So you can imagine how each of these conditions disturb the self, disturb the way we feel about ourselves in very specific ways, in very different ways, and hence shed light on different aspects of the self. So let me start with Alzheimer's disease. Now, Alzheimer's disease, as we know, by the time you get to the late stages, completely destroys a person's cognitive abilities, memories, to the point that they are unable to recognize them, anything about their own lives, their relatives, their loved ones. They really require help with day-to-day functioning in all senses of the word. So it is a very debilitating condition. But if you watch the progression of the disease, what's interesting or what's intriguing is that it attacks a particular aspect of one's self. And this aspect of the self is called the narrative self. Now, if I were to ask any of you, who are you? You'll be very likely to give me a story. You're going to tell me a story about your life. You're going to give me a narrative. You'll say, I was born here, I work here, I have, this is my family. Whatever narrative you choose, it will be a story that you'll tell about who you are. You're not going to say, I'm a body sitting here. You're actually going to give me a cognitive response. And that's, in some sense, it's not just a story we tell others, it's also the story that is constantly running within our own heads. It is how we think of ourselves. And philosophers have long argued, some of them, that the sense of being a person, the sense of being an I to which things happen, is constituted solely by these narratives that the brain is spinning. So, and if you take away the narratives, there will be no I. Now, Alzheimer's really challenges that way of thinking about the self. For instance, if you take someone who's in the mid stages of Alzheimer's disease, if you were to talk to them about their narrative, you ask them who they are, ask them to talk to you about their story, they will be able to narrate some aspects of their life story, but depending on how far the disease has progressed, you'll realize that their temporal ordering of their own story has got scrambled. So something about the narrative inside their own minds about who they are is starting to get messed up. And by the time the disease progresses to its full extent, they have lost pretty much all of their narrative self. Now, again, the question here is what they've lost complete in the sense that just because they're unable to tell you a story, have they lost everything about their narrative? And Alzheimer's challenges the notion that this narrative is purely consciously recalled cognitive processes. So there's a story I'll tell you about a patient in Toronto who was being looked after by a researcher at a Jewish care home. She had been there during a Jewish high holiday, and a lot of the patients were standing in line to go to the podium and say a prayer during their festival. And her patient, who was a very elderly gentleman in very late stages of the disease, someone who would be otherwise unable to say even 2 words at a time, was standing ready to go and say the prayer. And she was very, very concerned that he would find it extremely stressful when he ended up on the stage. And she was stressed for him. And as it happened, he climbed onto the podium, stood there, and narrated a complete prayer with utter proficiency, and then came back to the room and relapsed back into his old self of being unable to say more than 2 words. And the researcher's contention is that this was a kind of embodied response, that the reason why the gentleman was able to say the prayer with such proficiency was because his body, his entire being, was in the presence of cues in the surroundings that enabled him to elicit this response. There was the congregation in front of him, the presence of the rabbi, he had his hand on the Torah. All of these things elicited in him a response that was very much a part of his selfhood, except that it's not a selfhood that he could consciously recall in other circumstances. So there was something about the way he was at that time that can be called embodied. And when one says embodied, you're not just saying that it's just in the body, it's obviously the brain and the body together, but there are things that we are in terms of our selfhood that is not just about consciously recalling who we are. There are subconscious cognitive processes that are going on, and our body is very much a part of that mix, and a lot of our selfhood is in that sense embodied. For instance, another very interesting example is that of the American composer Aaron Copland. Now it was reported that he, during his late stages of the disease, was forgetful to the point where you left him at the end of the street, he wouldn't know where he was, but you put him in front of his orchestra and he could conduct the Appalachian Spring. Where did that aspect of his being come from? In some sense, that was an embodied response. So it's suggesting that our narrative self, our autobiographical self, the story that we are, is not just about consciously recalled, conscious recall or cognitive processes that depend on conscious recall, but there are other kinds of cognitive processes that are embodied, and they are important too. Now, in terms of cognitive computing, I think what this tells us is that in situations where we're dealing with learning, we really need to be paying attention to how our bodies learn. And that's very much a part of who we are. So any computing interface that is merely interacting with us cognitively is probably being limited in what it can achieve. So if you were to engage the whole body in some sense, the learning would be probably much deeper. And it also raises the question of, am I my narrative? So, if the narrative is gone, as does happen in Alzheimer's, Alzheimer's will eventually get also to the embodied selfhood. So even the embodied part of the narrative goes away. What is left? Are we saying that the person who is left is unable now to feel pain or hunger as their own, even though that there is no sense of being a person with a story, but isn't there still someone in there who is capable of taking ownership of a sensation, of an emotion? We don't know the answer to that because we can't interrogate people in late-stage Alzheimer's. Unfortunately, they're so debilitated that it's almost impossible to understand what might be happening. Caregivers and people who are looking after end-stage Alzheimer's patients will say things like, you know, the person I knew once is no more, or there is no one in there anymore. Now, those are all observations from the outside. Those are our perceptions from the outside. We really don't know what the subjective experience is of a person with Alzheimer's at end stage. So, you know, what is left when the narrative goes? Is there still an I? It's an open question. Or what is that I? Let me come to this other condition, which is very rare. Most of you may not have heard of it at all. It's this condition called body integrity identity disorder. And it's a condition in which people feel like some part of their body is not theirs. And this is speaking to the idea that our sense of our bodily self, the sense I have of being this body with 2 arms, 2 legs, is actually malleable. It can change, and it can change in ways that we sometimes find very difficult. To give you an example, let me just explain a small experiment called the rubber hand illusion. Many of you may be familiar with it, but it's worth going over just to show you how malleable our sense of our bodily self is. So sit down at a table, for example, put your left hand on the table, put a screen next to it so that you can't see your own left hand. Get a rubber hand. You can buy it for $5 on Amazon. It's something manicurists use it to train themselves to paint nails. You can get that. Put that on the table next to you. You can only see the rubber hand. You can't see your own hand because the screen is there in between. Have a friend take 2 paintbrushes and start brushing your hand and the rubber hand synchronously, which means exactly at the same pace, exactly at the same places on the hand. And within 2 minutes, about 2/3 of you are going to feel something very, very intriguing, which is that the sense of touch, which you are feeling on your real hand, will shift to the location of the rubber hand. It's as if the brain says, oh, you know, the rubber hand is mine. This is where the touch must be happening. Now, what's happening in a very simplistic sense is that the brain is being fed conflicting sense information. You're feeding the brain tactile information by brushing the real hand, which is your sense of touch. But you're giving it visual input because you're watching the rubber hand being stroked with a brush. Now, the brain reconciles these conflicting inputs by deciding that the hand must be at the location of the rubber hand. And it will actually switch your sense of the touch in terms of where the brush is to the location of the rubber hand. And it's something I can speak about this over and over again. It'll make no sense until you actually experience it, and then it's shocking. It's just really weird to experience a touch at a location where you know your body is not there. What has happened? The brain has incorporated the rubber hand into its model of what the body is. It's basically embodied the rubber hand. And this is, again, something to think about in terms of, you know, cognitive computing, that our body model, what we perceive our body to be, is flexible to a very large extent sometimes. And yet it is not. So coming back to this condition, BIID, the best way to sort of understand what might be happening here is to think about another condition which, again, a lot of us would be familiar with, which is phantom limbs. Now, if somebody has had an amputation, occasionally what happens is, even after the amputation, people continue to feel the presence of their limb. So if they have had the leg amputated because of an injury or an accident, oftentimes they will continue to feel that the leg is still there. And some of them will even feel pain in that limb, in that non-existent limb. So this is called phantom pain. Now, one explanation for this is that the brain, you know, when you think about what the brain is really there for or why it must have evolved, one of the basic functions that the brain has to do is help the body survive, which means help the body navigate the environment it is in, maintain the body in a physiologically viable state of existence, help it be in homeostasis, all of these physiological things. And in order to do that, as the brain evolved, it started modeling the body itself. So it's part of how the brain controls the body and helps the body move around is by having an internal model of the body. There must be many maps and many models inside our brain of our own body. And normally, if everything is working well, the maps in our brain that represent the body should be congruent with the physical body, right? And occasionally things go wrong, like in the case of phantom limbs, where the limb has been amputated, but somehow the maps in the brain, the information content in the brain that represents the body has not got reorganized, and you continue to feel the limb. There is a subtle but very important point to be made here, which is that what is it that you're perceiving? When you sit here and, all of you right now, when you're perceiving your body, what is it that you're perceiving? You're perceiving the information that the brain has about your body rather than the actual body. And as it happens, the actual body and the map should be congruent and everything. So in reality, you should be perceiving your physical body. But there will be situations where there's a mismatch. And when there's a mismatch, the information content in your brain seems to be paramount, not the physical body. And that is made really clear by this other condition called BIID. So that phrase, animation without incarnation, that is due to the head of neuropsychology at Zurich, University Hospital Zurich, Professor Peter Brugger. He called phantom limbs animation without incarnation, which means that the limb is animated in your mind, but it's not incarnate anymore because it's been amputated, so the limb is not there. And BIID he thought of as the mirror problem, incarnation without animation, where it is incarnated in the sense that the limb is perfectly fine, physiologically healthy, functional, but somehow in your mind, the limb has a very different character. And in this particular condition, the limb is basically such that it doesn't feel like it's yours. It feels alien. It feels like it shouldn't be there. And people, I've talked to many people with this condition, and they really do say that they suffer very badly from it, to the point that it drives them to amputation. So this is something that will be shocking to a lot of you, and that makes sense that it should be shocking. But that's the extent of how these perceptual body perception problems can cause us to do things that seem very, very difficult to take. Again, the point here that I want to make is that the perception we have of our body is based on sort of maps that the brain is creating in order to help the brain control the body. And it's these maps that are malleable. I mean, we don't even know where those maps are for most part, but imagine a situation where we could figure out, what is going wrong with the mapping in the case of BIID, and we could help sort of correct that mapping rather than amputate the limb in order to match the map with the physical body. So, and you can extend this argument to situations where you're involved in a computing environment that is dealing with the body and the mind. And once we better understand how our bodily self is created, maybe the computing environment also starts dealing with those very body maps. That's just at this point speculation, but in terms of future directions of thinking about how cognitive computation is going to interact with humans. I'm going to skip over a couple of these. Schizophrenia was one I looked at where people have an altered sense of reality because of their psychosis, they're hearing voices, and this also tells us a lot about certain aspects of the sense of self. There's also depersonalization disorder where people feel distance from their own bodily self and emotions. Again, I don't have time to go into this, but let me come to autism. We heard yesterday Professor DiCarlo talking about theory of mind, this instinctive ability we all have to watch someone else and infer what might be going on in their minds, right? We look at behavioral cues, we look at posture, facial expressions, all sorts of cues that are being processed subconsciously by our brain. And within us arises a perception of what might be happening in someone else's mind. We have a theory of what might be happening in someone else's mind just by watching them do whatever they're doing. We kind of have a sense of what their desires are at that moment in time or what their intentions are. So we theorize, and hence it's called theory of mind. And as it happens, children with autism, even adults with autism, show an impaired theory of mind. They are unable to do this otherwise instinctive act. It takes a lot of effort for them to be able to read another person's mind. So, and what has become, the theory of mind is essentially a behavioral aspect of our sense of self, but what autism is beginning to show us is that at least there's preliminary work that's suggesting that the theory of mind problems could be rooted in disruptions of the bodily self, the way someone with autism perceives their own bodily self, how deeply grounded they are in their own body. The behavioral traits like an impaired theory of mind could be a downstream consequence of having an impaired bodily self. And this is, at this point, early research, but if indeed it turns out to be the case, then you can imagine that the case for having a very grounded bodily self becomes more and more important, because just about everything downstream, or upstream as some others would say, but basically, even cognitive processes, conscious cognitive processes, and social behaviors could have a lot to do with the way we feel about our own bodies. And I think during the panel discussion, we'll come back to this a little bit more. I want to speak a little bit about autoscopic phenomena, or out-of-body experiences. Now, these are very intriguing phenomena that shed a lot of light on our sense of self. So hopefully all of us right now are having an in-body experience, right? We are actually grounded in our bodies. We are within our bodies. We occupy a volume of space that is the body. We have a sense of ownership of the body and have a perspective on the world. All of that is part of being an embodied self. And there are situations in which these can be disrupted. For instance, the doppelganger effect. During the doppelganger experience, people can see their own duplicate in front of them, another virtual self, and sometimes they just see the virtual self. Sometimes their self, the thing that we are, the I that perceives, moves between the physical body and the virtual body, and sometimes it moves back and forth in rapid succession to the point that it becomes very, very frightening. And it can be caused because of tumors. It can have sort of neurological neurological explanations, and also the classical outer body experience, in which people say that they've left their body and are looking down at their body from above. Now, in all of these things, it seems like something is actually leaving the body. Turns out that nothing is actually leaving the body. It's just a certain kind of processing in the brain that has gone awry. And it helps us understand, first of all, how does the brain create the in-body experience in the first place? And it seems that the way it does it is by having all the sensations that are coming from outside the body and from within. So exteroception, which is external sensations, perception of external sensations, and interoceptions. There are a lot of sensations that come into the brain from within the body that we are not consciously privy to. And the brain takes all of this information and somehow integrates them to create a sense of being a body, and locates this sense of I that we have geometrically in this volume. And sometimes our processing can go wrong, and you can have the I located in a geometric location that is outside this volume. So it seems to be information processing gone wrong rather than your soul leaving the body or anything like that. But again, think about it in cognitive computing terms. Now, if this is a process that can be, either it's a process to be aware of, you don't want to induce out-of-body experiences during your computing experience unintentionally, or if there is a reason for you to create an out-of-body experience in a virtual setup for whatever reason that your experience demands, then understanding how the brain creates the in-body experience is going to help us a lot in trying to create other experiences. So I think I'm running out of time, right? So I'll stop here. I mean, the last thing I want to leave you with is, in all these conditions, one of the things that becomes very clear is that the sense of I, take Alzheimer's, we are saying that somebody has lost their narrative self, but there is still potentially an I that is experiencing the loss of a narrative self. So you can either be an I that has a narrative self or an I that has lost the narrative self. What is that I? Same thing with BIID. You can be someone who experiences your own body as if you own every part of your body. So there is an I that experiences body ownership, or you can be someone for whom part of your leg doesn't belong to you. So the I is still there, either experiencing body ownership or lack of body ownership. Same thing with autism. You know that autism affects one's social self, the ability to socially relate to someone. You can be an I that relates socially in the way we all do usually, the so-called neurotypicals, or you can be an I that experiences social relatedness differently, but there is still an I. What is that I, right? And these questions keep coming up. In all of these conditions, even though you take away certain aspects of the self, there is still an I experiencing the lack of whatever that you took away. And it turns out that this is what philosophers, neuroscientists, theologians, because theologians have also been very involved in understanding the nature of the self, are arguing about when they are arguing about whether there is a self or whether there is not a self. They're not arguing about the narrative. They're not arguing about things like body ownership, because it's very clear that those things are constructed by the brain and body together, and they are malleable, and they can be actually wrong, and so they're not really what we are fussed about. What we are really fussed about is this sense of being a subject of an experience, whatever that experience might be. Where does that subjectivity come from? And we have a whole class of theorists called bundle theorists who are in the no-self camp, people like the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who said that we are nothing but a bundle of perceptions, that you take away all those perceptions and there is no I. Buddhist philosophers will pretty much take that same line, that we are just a bundle of perceptions, and you take away the perceptions and there is no I. But there are other philosophers who will argue, no, we need some very minimal neural process in the brain that is able to create that sense of subjectivity first, and then everything else gets added on, the more complex personhood that we are. So people like Dan Zahavi, who's a philosopher at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark, he would be a self-theorist. There are yet others who will say that the self, this sense of being an I, is nothing but consciousness. So some say that consciousness has the property of being reflexive. So every moment of consciousness is aware of itself. There is no person. We can just think of ourselves as being a whole bunch of discrete moments of conscious experience. Somehow the brain takes all of these conscious experiences and then constructs the big complex selfhood that we have. But it's that they're arguing about, and we don't know the answer to this as to whether there is an I, or what is that I, or whether it's an illusion. And I suspect, like most people do in neuroscience, that the answer will come down to understanding the nature of consciousness, and we are very far from that. So I will leave you with that. Thank you.